would have not imagined during my career ever going to work with like a sports psychologist. That just wasn't a thing. It wasn't until my senior year where they didn't give me a choice. And I was like, this is stupid. But what I saw back then and what I saw in my research too, was that we just shoved it all down and we're like, we're fine. Like, we're fine. We're going to be okay. And it just like wasn't a thing. And I think what's happening is they are shoving it down. This younger generation is acting like they're fine, but it's manifesting on an amplified stage in a way that it didn't manifest in our previous generations.
Well, let me ask this. I mean, the good side of that coin, or the other side of that coin, is while a lot of things are happening that, more and more kids are struggling, I think more and more kids are also open to going and getting help.
Yeah.
And parents are open to getting them help.
Yeah.
So I mean, as you look back on your story, I mean, what could what would you do different today? And what can kids and what can parents, how can parents recognize that before it's gone on for 4 or 5 years? How do we recognize and get our kids help?
So I think like it kind of boils down to like what we're seeing, like break it down in the simplest of ways so parents can see what actually we're worried about, right? Because the reality is I actually worry just as much as the high performer and the perfectionist as I do about the one who's not performing. And that I do is about the one who has the eating disorder and the one who has the yips and the one who looks like they have it all together. They're usually the ones that I'm like, I have my eye on you the most because you're the one that actually makes me the most nervous, not these guys. Because you have to remember, if you think about it in like a general, what is the underlying problem? It's the best way to describe it is it's called our window of tolerance. So your window of tolerance is when you're calm, cool, and collected. Think about like when you're in flow, like the best races of your life, the best games of your life, you are calm, you are cool, or you're collected, you're not overthinking anything. Then what happens is you either go up or you go down. Right? Up is like anxiety, panic, eating disorders, overwhelmed, chaotic responses, angry outburst. Down is your depression, right? It's your depression, it's your freezing, it's your underperformance, it's like your dissociation, your separation from self, right? So the first thing as we understand in parents is how can we better understand when our kids are not in that calm, cool, collected space, right? Remember, perfectionism is going to hit on the top, right? Because it's a form of hyperarousal, which is on the top. The first thing you have to understand is, okay, how can we identify where we are? How can we make them feel not crazy? Because I like to joke, like, we will go up and down all day throughout the day, depending on what's happening. It's a better understanding of why is it happening and what's going on. So then we have to understand why we leave our window, right? The reasons we would leave our window is fear of anything. Awesome. Any core related belief about self gets triggered. So that's like, I'm not good enough. Something's wrong with me. I'm defective. I'm unseen. I'm abandoned. Like, I'm going to be embarrassed. Like, anything of that being triggered means we go up or we go down, right? So the first thing is we also understand how we can make our window bigger, which is implementing a lot of skills, right? So that's kind of where I come in, where I'm like, okay, let's implement these skills that help make our window bigger. And then let's start to understand why we're leaving our window in the first place and work on that deeply rooted belief, right? Because we think that we can talk our way out of it. You actually can't. Like, if this is your brain, this is your amygdala, this is your brain, this is your prefrontal cortex, the part that thinks, right? When we get triggered and we go up, your brain flips up, which is why when you're talking to a toddler, when you're talking to a teenager, when you're talking to anyone who is like totally outside their window of tolerance, it's why rational speaking doesn't work. You're like, but rationally, can you see that you did well? Like, can you see? And you're like, they're like, no. And it's because you have to get the window to come down, right? You have to get the brain to come back down in order to then have the conversation. Does that make sense? And so as parents, look for that. Like, look for, are we outside of our window of tolerance? Are you seeing things that aren't normal, or are they just perpetually living outside of it? Does that make sense?
How can you identify when you talk about, so you need to have that conversation when their brain is down, so to speak. How can you identify, and are there certain moments when that's better than other moments, or is it just per kid?
It kind of depends on the kid, but it also kind of depends on what's happening. So like identifying is like, it's kind of like, okay, after a game, if you're in a car and you're talking to the kid and you're like trying to bombard them with positive thoughts and they're like, yeah, 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 or they don't believe it or they're shutting it down, they're not inside their window of tolerance. So it's like, I always say, like, it's kind of like the regulate yourself for parents. Regulate yourself first and then regulate your kid, right? So like regulating your, like have them like deep breathing, have them doing counter positive to self, have them doing like cold shower. Like remember the vagus nerve. I always say like right here is where your vagus nerve connects, like massage right there and pull down on your ears, or like pull, there's right here is a connection point, and massage right there. So like focusing on getting them like inside their window of tolerance. Think of when your kid is like able to be calm, cool, and engaged, they're inside their window of tolerance. When your kid is like snippy or irritable or anxious, or they're not eating, or you can see like that is not going to work. Like rationally talking to them isn't going to work at that point in time. Does that make sense?
It does. It totally makes sense. I think, one of the things that I wrestled with, and I think parents wrestle with today is, there's a certain level of things from an athletic standpoint that we view as kind of normal struggles. And so it becomes like, as a parent, especially when my kids are younger, I want to parent them through these normal struggles. And understanding and recognizing when have we gotten to a point where what I'm doing is not working and this is maybe getting worse and we need help. And I think what I typically see is by the time we as parents feel like we're at that point, we should have recognized we were at that point a long time ago. So help us out. As most parents want the best for their kids, and sometimes too much. But how do we recognize those things and reach out for help
when it's time to get professional help? Yeah.
Here's the thing: I've only been a parent for 2 years, been a swimmer for a lot longer, and I've been a mental health counselor for a lot longer than I've been a parent. But it can tell you that innately in our bones as parents, we want to do whatever we can to help our kid. Even if we are completely messing it up, right? My husband and I are both therapists, so our poor children, like my husband was also like a sniper in the Marine Corps and I was a national champion. Like, again, our poor children, like we love them. They'll probably be in therapy from a young age, right? But I think the first thing is, as a parent, is give yourself grace, right? Whether it is your first kid, your fourth kid, or your sixth kid, like you are still going to be figuring it out on the sixth kid the way you were on the first kid. And I think sometimes that like I see my parents beat themselves up far more than they should in this office. I see parents who don't beat themselves up at all that I'm like, you're the problem, right? But like usually if a parent is asking me a question like that, then the reality of the answer is that they usually need to know they're not the problem, and they usually need to know that they're not the ones that are like really deeply innately causing everything, right? Like this is a terrible thing that I learned in school that I'm just going to openly fear, but our core beliefs are formed about by the time we're 5, right? So those negative beliefs about self are formed by the time they're 5. How they manifest changes, right? And they can be, I have seen that these beliefs sometimes get created in the simplicity of like, I fell at school and my parent wasn't there, or I broke my arm and it took mom or dad 30 minutes to get to me. And they're things that like through the lens of a 5-year-old seem catastrophic. And through the lens of an adult, sometimes you're like, that was what did it. And sometimes there's something so simple. Like I found out my panic that was happening in open water was I fell in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay on a knee board when I was 6. And the boat didn't turn around right away. The boat turned around within like 2 minutes. Like it didn't take as long, but in my brain, it was like an eternity. Right. And so sometimes as parents, we think that like we have done this awful, horrible thing. And we've messed up our kids forever. Those are usually the ones that I'm like, you didn't. We can work with it. We can regulate their nervous systems. So the first thing I say is give yourself some grace, because you need it. That usually means you're a good parent and you're one who cares, right? When it comes to seeing the signs, some of it is regular life. So I always say if you're dealing with like kind of the difference between anxiety and nervousness is like anxiety it's like a cycle. It's like they are living and breathing and like, I'm going to fail. They're ruminating on negative thoughts. They are like puking before their games. You're watching the yips happen, or you're watching like negative things perpetually happen over and over again, and they're not overcoming it. So it's like they're scanning for danger, they have physical symptoms, their thoughts are super narrow, and then they like avoid or escape, and then they like get short-term relief, but then it comes into like long-term worry and fear. That is usually anxiety, right? When it comes to just nervousness or jitters or dealing with like pressure or dealing with like failure or disappointment, that's usually like parents can step in pretty good there, right? Like if we're dealing with pressure, if we're dealing with disappointment, I always say the difference between you and Michael Phelps or you and Michael Jordan is they've just failed more times than you, right? They've just been disappointed more times than you. Right. And so if we're dealing with those kinds of things, like you're doing great. But if you're looking up and seeing like, does this feel like something bigger? Right? As parents, you know, in your core and in your body, if you get quiet enough that there's something wrong, right? You don't need anyone to tell you.